They said she'd be alone forever. The cowboy said, "Forever starts with me." The story starts with the wind moved restlessly across the Wyoming plains that evening, whistling through the dry grass and rattling the shutters of a lonely cabin at the edge of town. Inside, Clara Jennings sat by the fire with her mending basket, the needle glinting in the amber light. Her hands were steady, practiced, and quiet, like everything else in her life. The house creaked with the weight of silence. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed too loud. She had grown used to it over the years, that echo of emptiness that followed her everywhere since Elias died. 5 years had passed since the accident at the ranch, a falling beam, a single scream, then nothing but grief and the sound of the wind for company. People in Willow Creek had stopped calling her by her name. To them, she was simply the widow on the edge of town, a woman whose luck had died along with her husband. Some whispered that she talked to ghosts, others that she was cursed. Clara never corrected them. Words had a way of losing meaning after a while. That morning she saddled her old mare, Daisy, and rode into town for supplies. The journey was quiet, the sky pale and open, the prairie stretching endlessly in every direction. As she entered the main street, conversation dimmed. Folks nodded politely but their eyes slid past her. In the general store, the smell of dust and kerosene hung in the air. Clara set her small list on the counter. "Flour, salt, and kerosene if it's not too dear," she said softly. The storekeeper, Mr. Weller, gave her a hesitant smile. "Still out there alone, Mrs. Jennings?" Clara returned a faint one. Still standing. Behind her, 2 young women whispered near the window, their voices sharp as needles. "She still wears black? After all this time?" "Some women just can't let go. Or maybe no one else wants them." Clara pretended not to hear. She gathered her parcel, thanked the storekeeper, and stepped back into the bright morning light. But their words followed her, burning more than the sun. By the time she reached the ridge overlooking her cabin, the sky had changed. Thick gray clouds rolled in from the mountains, heavy with rain. The air felt electric, humming low like a warning. She quickened Daisy's pace, clutching the reins as the first drops began to fall. Within minutes, the heavens opened. The wind whipped at her shawl, rain stung her face, and lightning cracked across the plains. Daisy stumbled in the mud, nearly throwing her off. Clara's heart pounded as she fought to keep her balance. Then, through the storm's veil, she saw movement. A lone rider emerging from the rain, his silhouette tall in the saddle, a dark slicker clinging to his frame. He slowed as he neared her, water running from the brim of his hat. "You shouldn't be out here alone, ma'am," he called over the thunder. His voice was low, steady, unhurried, the kind of voice that seemed to quiet everything around it. Storms turning mean. Clara hesitated. Strangers were rare out this way and she'd learned not to trust easily. Still, something in his tone, respectful, almost gentle, made her nod. "Home's not far," she said. "Then let's get you there before the sky takes a mind to split in two." They rode side by side, his horse pacing calmly beside hers. When lightning flashed, she caught a glimpse of his face, rugged, perhaps a few years younger than her, with eyes the color of a summer storm. He didn't talk much and she found herself grateful for that. Words, she'd learned, could be heavier than silence. By the time they reached her cabin, both were soaked through. Clara dismounted quickly and opened the door. "You might as well come in till the worst passes," she said. "It's no time to be riding blind." He hesitated, then nodded. "Obliged, ma'am." Inside, Clara lit a lamp and coaxed the fire back to life. The stranger stood near the door, his hat dripping, water pooling around his boots. "You can set your things there," she offered, motioning to the peg by the hearth. He hung his slicker and removed his hat, revealing damp, dark hair and a face marked by the sun and miles. "Name's Luke Carver," he said quietly. "Clara Jennings." He nodded once. "Pleasure, Mrs. Jennings." For a while, the only sounds were the rain on the roof and the crackling of the fire. Luke's eyes drifted to the mantel, where a faded photograph sat in a wooden frame, a young man smiling beside a wagon. "Your husband?" he asked gently. Clara's hands paused over the kettle. "Yes. Been gone some years now." He didn't press further, didn't offer empty condolences. He just nodded, gaze steady on the fire. "World don't hand out much mercy," he murmured. "No," Clara agreed softly. "Not unless you fight for it." Something in the way he looked at her, quiet understanding, not pity, made her throat tighten. It had been so long since anyone saw her as more than the widow. When the storm finally eased, Luke stood and reached for his hat. "I best be moving on before dark." "You're welcome to stay till morning," she said, surprising herself. He shook his head. "You've done enough." He turned to the door but paused, his hand resting on the latch. "No one ought to face a storm alone, ma'am," he said. "Not in this world." Then he stepped into the mist and vanished into the wet night. Clara closed the door slowly, her heart unexpectedly full, not of sadness this time but something quieter, almost unfamiliar. Hope maybe. Or the memory of it. She looked toward the empty chair where he'd sat, steam still rising from the mug he'd left untouched. For the first time in years, the silence in her cabin didn't feel like a burden. It felt waiting. And out on the porch, half buried in rainwater, Luke's hat lay forgotten, dark, worn, and heavy with the scent of the storm. Claire didn't see it that night. But in the morning, when the sun broke over the horizon and lit the wet earth in gold, it would be there, a quiet sign that not every goodbye means an ending. Sometimes it's where forever begins. The next morning broke soft and pale over the Wyoming plains. The storm had passed, leaving the earth washed clean and shining. Dew glistened on the grass, and the air smelled of wet sage and pine. Clara Jennings stepped out onto her porch, her boots sinking slightly into the damp boards. She squinted against the sunlight and drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The first thing she noticed was the hat, resting on the porch rail, heavy with rain from the night before. Worn, weathered, and shaped by years of use. It must have been his. She picked it up carefully, running her fingers along the brim. It was damp, faintly smelling of leather, dust, and smoke, the scent of the man who'd ridden through a storm to see her safely home. "Luke Carver," she murmured quietly, as if saying his name might call him back. Inside, she set the hat by the fire to dry. But all through the morning, as she swept the floors and fed her goats, her eyes kept drifting toward it. She told herself she'd ride into town later to return it, that it was the proper thing to do, but a part of her, deep down, didn't want to let it go just yet. The hat made her cabin feel less empty somehow. By afternoon, she finally saddled Daisy and started down the trail toward Willow Creek. The sky was clear, and the smell of rain lingered sweet in the air. She asked a few townsfolk if they'd seen Luke Carver. Most hadn't. Then old Tom Whitlow, the blacksmith, looked up from his anvil. "Carver? Aye, he's over at my brother's place, the Whitlow Ranch. Helping mend fences and dig post holes. Quiet fella but works hard." Clara nodded. "Thank you." As she rode toward the ranch, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, a nervous flutter in her chest, like a schoolgirl's foolish excitement. It was absurd, she told herself. He was a stranger, a drifter. Still, she couldn't ignore how his kindness had unsettled her solitude. The Whitlow Ranch came into view, an old spread with sagging fences and tired horses grazing in the field. Luke was there, shirt sleeves rolled, hammering a fence post into the ground. His movements were calm and steady, each swing sure and deliberate. Clara dismounted quietly, holding his hat in her hands. "You left this," she said softly. He turned, a faint smile crossing his face. "Guess I did. Didn't realize till I was halfway here." "Thank you." She stepped closer, offering it out. For a moment their fingers brushed, brief, electric. She felt her breath hitch but quickly withdrew her hand. "You didn't have to ride all this way," he said. "I don't mind a good ride," she answered, then added with a trace of humor, "Besides, a man without his hat's bound to catch cold." That made him laugh, a quiet, surprised sound that seemed to reach all the way to his eyes. "You sound like you know a thing or two about cowboys," he said. "Used to," Clara replied, her tone softening. Luke studied her for a moment, the wind tugging lightly at her hair. "You don't talk like the others," he said finally. "Most folks in town look at me like I'm just passing trouble." Clara looked out across the plains, the wind sweeping the grass into waves. "They say the same about me," she admitted. "Guess we're both ghosts to this town." He looked at her then, truly looked, past the worn shawl and tired eyes, past the years of loneliness she carried like a weight. "You don't seem like a ghost to me," he said quietly. Her throat tightened and for a heartbeat she couldn't speak. She simply nodded, turning toward her horse. "You take care of yourself, Mr. Carver." "Luke," he said. She hesitated. "Luke then." "Thank you for the hat, and the fire," he added. Clara managed a small smile. "Thank you for getting me home." She mounted her horse, but before she left, she heard him call after her. "Ma'am?" "Yes." He tilted his hat, the faintest grin on his face. "No one ought to face a storm alone, even if it's not rain and death." Her heart gave a strange little twist. She didn't answer, just touched the brim of her bonnet and rode off toward home. That night, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, the fire glowing low beside her. Outside, the plains were still, the stars bright as polished glass. She thought about the man with the quiet voice and the gentle hands, the one who hadn't looked at her with pity or judgment, just simple respect. Maybe he'd ride off soon. Drifters always did. But somehow that didn't matter as much as it once might have. Because for the first time in 5 long years, Clara Jennings didn't feel invisible anymore. And as the wind whispered through the cottonwoods outside, she thought she could almost hear it say his words again, soft and sure, like a promise meant only for her. No one ought to face a storm alone. The days that followed passed in that slow, quiet rhythm the frontier was known for, the kind of stillness that could feel both peaceful and heavy at once. Clara went about her chores, fetching water, mending clothes for townsfolk who still brought her work despite their whispers, and tending her small garden. Life didn't change much. Except it had. Every few days she'd catch sight of Luke Carver riding past her land. Sometimes he'd stop to help mend a broken fence post or split firewood, claiming he was just passing through. Other times he'd leave without a word, tipping his hat as he rode off. And though they never spoke of it, both knew these small visits meant something. One morning Clara brought a basket of mended shirts into town. The autumn sun was sharp and clean, painting the mountains gold. She walked through the square, nodding politely at familiar faces. But she could feel their eyes following her, like burrs clinging to her back. She stopped at the post office, exchanging a few coins for letters addressed to no one, circulars and bills. As she turned to leave she heard it. 2 women by the water trough whispering just loud enough. That widow's been seen with that drifter again. Luke Carver? The one who works for the Whitlows. MHM. He's got trouble written all over him. Folks like him don't settle down, they take what they can and move on. You'd think she'd know better by now. Her husband's barely cold in the ground. Clara froze. Her hand tightened around the handle of her basket. For a long moment she just stood there, head bowed, trying to breathe past the sting in her chest. She didn't say a word. She simply walked out of town, her steps even but heavy. By the time she reached the ridge overlooking her cabin, the sky had dimmed and a cold wind had begun to rise. She stopped at the edge of the creek and sat on the rocks, watching the water rush by. That was where Luke found her. He came riding up slow, his horse snorting softly. When he saw her sitting there, hands folded in her lap, he dismounted without a word and sat down beside her. For a while neither spoke. The only sound was the river and the wind through the cottonwoods. Finally Luke said, "You left town early." She gave a bitter smile. Couldn't stomach the talk. "Let me guess," he said. "About me." Clara glanced sideways at him. "And me?" He nodded once, jaw tightening. "Small towns got long memories and short mercy. Don't take it to heart." She threw a small stone into the water. "It's not their words that hurt. It's how easily they believe them." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They used to talk about me that way too. Back in Abilene. Said I brought death with me, 'cause my brother got trampled in a stampede I should have stopped." Clara looked at him then, really looked. There was something raw behind his eyes, something familiar. "You carry that?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Every mile I ride." She drew in a slow breath. "Then I reckon we're both ghosts in our own ways." "Maybe," he said, watching the river swirl around the stones. "But maybe ghosts just need someone to see 'em, remind 'em they're still here." Their eyes met, hers tired but kind, his dark and searching. And for a moment the weight of the past lifted. Not gone but lighter. When Clara rose to leave, Luke stood too. He offered his hand to help her climb the bank, and when she took it, he didn't let go right away. "You shouldn't walk home alone this late," he said. "I've been walking alone a long time," she replied. "I know," he murmured. "That's what I don't like about it." Her chest tightened, a strange warmth blooming where cold had lived too long. As they walked back toward her cabin, the wind carried the faint sound of the church bell from town. And though neither said another word, something had shifted, subtle, certain, and unspoken. By the time they reached her porch, Clara turned to him and said almost shyly, "You could stay for supper if you'd like. It's only stew but—" He smiled faintly, tipping his hat. "Stew sounds just fine." That night they shared a quiet meal, no grand confessions, no promises. Just 2 people who'd been alone too long, finding comfort in the sound of another person's breath across a wooden table. Outside, the world whispered and the stars turned overhead. Inside, the silence between them softened, no longer heavy but tender. And though the town still whispered and the past still loomed, Clara Jennings felt, for the first time in years, that she wasn't fading anymore. Someone saw her. Someone stayed. The chill of early winter had begun to creep into Willow Creek. Frost clung to the tall grass each morning, and the sky carried that pale, brittle light that foretold the long cold months ahead. Clara Jennings had grown used to the rhythm of the season, hauling firewood, keeping her goats warm, and hanging herbs to dry above the stove. But this year the days didn't stretch quite as long, nor did the nights feel so empty. Because sometimes Luke Carver stopped by. He never announced himself. She would hear the sound of hooves crunching the frozen dirt, look up from her work, and find him leaning against the porch post, hat in hand, with that half-smile of his. Sometimes he brought firewood. Other times, nothing but his quiet company. They spoke of small things, weather, chores, the stubbornness of her goats, but underneath their words was a gentle, steady warmth neither dared name. Clara told herself not to hope. He was a drifter. Men like that had a way of leaving before the spring thaw. But still, she caught herself listening for his footsteps at dusk. It was near midnight when the knock came. Sharp, urgent. Clara startled awake, lantern still burning low beside her bed. When she opened the door, a young ranch hand stood there, breathless and wide-eyed. Mrs. Jennings. Fire? At the Whitlow Ranch. It's spreading fast. Her heart lurched. Luke? He's there, they all are. They can't get the barn door open. Clara didn't think. She threw on her coat, grabbed a bucket and mounted Daisy bareback. The air was thick with smoke even before she reached the ridge. By the time she saw the glow on the horizon, the night sky looked like it was bleeding fire. Flames clawed at the barn roof, sparks shooting into the dark. Men shouted, water sloshed, horses screamed. Clara leapt from her horse and ran toward the smoke, coughing, her skirt catching ash. Luke, she shouted, her voice breaking. He appeared through the haze, shirt scorched, face blackened with soot. He was dragging a trapped colt toward the door, his shoulder straining against a fallen beam. Get back, he yelled, but Clara didn't listen. She ran to him, heaving her shoulder under the other side of the beam. Together they pushed, once, twice, until it gave way and fell aside. The colt bolted into the night. The structure groaned behind them, fire roaring higher. A beam splintered above and came crashing down, striking Luke across the back. Luke, she screamed, dropping beside him. He tried to rise but collapsed again, choking on smoke. Clara's hands shook as she dragged him by his collar, coughing and crying, the heat searing her arms. Somehow, through sheer terror and love she hadn't yet admitted, she pulled him out into the cold night. By the time they reached the open field, she fell beside him, gasping. His eyes were half closed, skin pale beneath the soot. Don't you dare, she whispered, gripping his shirt. Don't you dare leave me too. He stirred faintly, his voice hoarse. You shouldn't me come. Someone had to, she said fiercely. No one should face a fire alone. The same words he'd spoken to her that stormy night. A small, weary smile touched his lips before he slipped into unconsciousness. The ranch burned till dawn. By morning, it was nothing but smoldering ash and blackened timbers. Clara stayed by Luke's side the whole time, tending his burns, wrapping his shoulder, and refusing every offer to rest. When the doctor finally came, he shook his head. He's lucky to be alive. Another minute in there and he wouldn't have made it. Clara sat beside Luke long after the doctor left, her hands folded in her lap. Outside the wind had died. The world was quiet again. When he finally stirred, blinking against the light, she leaned close. You're safe, she whispered. He looked at her through tired eyes. Why'd you come for me? Because, she said softly, her throat tight, you came for me once. And I couldn't bear to think of you out there, alone. Luke stared at her for a long moment, then reached out, his rough fingers brushing her wrist. You're a stubborn woman, Clara Jennings. And you, she said, smiling through her tears, are impossible to forget. He chuckled weakly, the sound breaking and tender all at once. Outside, the first light of dawn broke over the plains, pink and gold against the smoke-streaked sky. The air smelled of soot and ashes but also of something else, renewal. In the days that followed, Luke stayed at Clara's cabin to heal. She fed him broth, changed his bandages, and scolded him when he tried to help with chores too soon. Each evening they'd sit on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. But always their hands found each other, slow, natural, certain. The fire had taken much. But it had also given something back. It had stripped away everything false, fear, pride, loneliness, until only truth remained. And the truth was this. They belonged to each other, whether either of them was ready to say it aloud or not. The snow began to fall in soft, hesitant flakes. It was the first snow of winter, the kind that made the whole valley seem hushed, blanketed in quiet white. Clara stood at the window, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. Luke was outside, stacking logs by the shed, his shoulder bound and his breath steaming in the morning air. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the fire. He was healing well, the doctor said. But in that time, Clara had come to fear something she hadn't felt in years, the weight of goodbye. Each day he grew stronger, and each day he spoke more often of the road. "Can't stay here forever," he'd say, voice low and distant as if talking to himself. And every time he said it, something inside her sank a little deeper. That morning Luke came in from the cold, brushing snow from his hat. He smelled of pine and smoke, that scent she'd come to know as comfort. "Looks like a storm rollin' in," he said, glancing at the window. "Should get the animals settled early." Clara nodded. "I already took care of them." He paused, hands still on his hat. "You didn't have to do that alone." She smiled faintly. "Seems I'm good at that part." He froze, just a fraction, and she saw the shadow in his eyes. "Clara," he began, but she turned away, setting her cup down too quickly. That evening, as the wind howled against the shutters, Luke sat by the fire, his coat folded beside him. His saddlebag was on the floor, packed. He'd been quiet all night. Finally she spoke. "So it's true then? You're leaving?" He looked up, his jaw tight. "There's work out west. Fences need mending. Cattle to move before spring. I can't." "You can't what?" she asked softly. He hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I can't stay where I don't belong." Clara's heart twisted. "And who told you that you don't?" He looked at her then, really looked, and for a long time neither spoke. "Clara," he said finally, "I'm not the kind of man you build a life with. I drift. Always have. You deserve more than a man who'll just ride away again." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "And what if I don't want more? What if I just want you?" He stood, crossing the room in 3 long strides, his hand brushing her cheek. "You'll find someone better. You'll see." She caught his wrist before he could pull away. "I already found someone right." The firelight flickered between them, painting their faces in amber and shadow. Luke's hand trembled where it cupped her jaw. For a moment, it seemed he might stay, that he might surrender to what they both already knew. But then his eyes softened with sorrow. He pressed a rough kiss to her forehead, lingering there as though memorizing her. "Goodbye, Clara." And before she could answer, he turned and stepped out into the falling snow. She stood in the doorway long after he'd gone, the cold biting through her dress. The sound of his horse faded into the wind until there was nothing left but silence and the faint creak of the pines. Inside, the cabin felt emptier than ever. The chair by the fire. The shelf where his gloves had sat. Even the air seemed still, as if holding its breath for a man who might never return. Clara sank into the chair he'd used, pressing her hand against the worn wood, and whispered the words he'd once said to her. "Forever starts with me." But this time the words broke on her lips. The weeks that followed were slow and hollow. She kept busy, fixing fences, feeding livestock, mending what was broken. But no matter what she did, there were moments she'd turn, expecting to see him standing there. Sometimes at dusk she'd go out to the porch and stare toward the horizon, watching the snow melt into mist. Some nights she dreamed of him, the sound of his laughter, the warmth of his hand. And when she woke she would whisper into the dark, "You said forever, Luke Carver. Don't you forget that." But the world moved on. Spring crept over Willow Creek, slow and tender. The frost thawed, the grass returned, and so did the robins, their songs echoing across the valley. Life began again. Still, a part of Clara couldn't shake the ache of something unfinished. Some stories, she thought, don't end. They just wait. And somewhere, beneath that wide and endless sky, she hoped Luke Carver was still thinking of her, and of the promise he didn't yet know he'd made. The thaw came late that year. Winter clung to Willow Creek like an old memory, reluctant to let go. The river still carried ice along its edges, and the mountains, far off and blue, seemed to watch the valley with a quiet kind of patience. Clara Jennings had learned patience too. 3 months had passed since Luke rode away. 3 months since the sound of hooves faded into the snow. The cabin had long since lost his scent, but not his presence. She still caught it sometimes, in the worn chair by the fire, in the saddle he'd mended before leaving. Life had gone on as it always does. The goats had birthed their kids. The hens were laying again. And each dawn she'd walk out into the field and breathe in the morning air, pretending the ache in her chest was just the chill of spring. But every sunset brought him back, in memory if not in body. It was a Sunday afternoon when she heard it, faint at first, carried on the wind. The slow rhythmic thud of hooves. She froze on the porch steps, her hands still dusted with flour from baking. It couldn't be. But as the sound grew nearer, her breath caught. The outline of a horse appeared through the haze of sun and dust, tall, chestnut brown, moving with a familiar ease. And then she saw him. Luke Carver, hat low, coat worn from the trail, a streak of gray dust across his cheek. For a long moment she couldn't move. The world seemed to stop, the birds, the wind, even her own heartbeat. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching the dirt, and looked up at her with that same quiet steadiness she remembered. "Afternoon, Clara," he said softly, as if no time had passed at all. Her throat tightened. You came back." He gave a slow nod. "Guess I did." They stood facing each other in silence, the spring breeze stirring the loose strands of her hair. Finally she found her voice. "Why?" He took off his hat, turning it in his hands. "I thought I could outrun what I was feeling. Thought if I rode far enough, maybe it'd fade." "And did it?" He looked up then, his gaze meeting hers with quiet intensity. "No. It got louder." The words hung between them like a truth too long unsaid. "I tried to forget you," he continued, voice low. "Tried working from sunup to sundown. Tried drinking. Tried moving on. But every time I closed my eyes I saw your face, hearing you say my name like it meant something. And I realized," he swallowed hard, "forever don't start out there. It starts right here." He pointed to the ground between them, her porch, her home, her world. Clara's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. "You promised you wouldn't come back unless you meant to stay." He nodded slowly. "And I mean it now." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of all the things they hadn't said, all the nights she'd waited, all the miles he'd crossed just to be standing there again. Finally she took a slow step forward. "You hurt me, Luke Carver." "I know." "You left without a word." "I know." Her voice trembled. "Then why do I still want to run to you?" He closed the distance between them in 3 strides and took her face in his hands, rough palms trembling against her skin. "Because," he whispered, "we were never finished." She should have turned away, she told herself she would. But when his forehead touched hers, the fight drained out of her. All that was left was the truth. "I missed you," she breathed. He smiled faintly, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. "I missed home." And then he kissed her, slow, certain, and full of every unspoken word between them. That evening they sat on the porch as the sun dipped low behind the hills, turning the world gold. Luke told her about the towns he'd passed, the ranch work he'd done, and the quiet nights where he couldn't stop thinking about her laughter echoing through this valley. Clara listened, her heart thawing with each word. "So," she said finally, "what happens now?" Luke leaned back in his chair, gaze fixed on the horizon. "Well, I figure I'll fix that roof you keep pretendin' don't leak. Maybe build a new fence by the stream. After that?" He looked at her with a half smile. "I reckon I'll see if a certain stubborn woman will let me stay for good." Clara laughed softly, the sound breaking like sunlight through clouds. "That depends," she said, tilting her head. "You planning to drift again?" He shook his head. "Not this time." The light faded, and the stars came out one by one, bright and clear against the indigo sky. Luke reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You know," he said quietly, "they told me some folks are meant to be alone." "Said that about you once, didn't they?" Clara smiled through her tears. "They did." He turned to her, eyes steady. "Well, they were wrong. Forever starts with me, Clara Jennings. And I ain't riding away from that again." She didn't answer, she didn't need to. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. And for the first time in years Clara believed in forever again. The sun rose soft and golden over Willow Creek, painting the hills in warmth. The snow had long melted, and the air was filled with the scent of wild sage and new grass. A gentle wind moved through the pines, whispering over the land like an old hymn. Clara Jennings stood on her porch, the morning light touching her face. Her dress fluttered against her legs, faded but clean, and her hair, streaked with sunlight, caught the breeze like gold silk. Behind her, the sound of hammering and the low murmur of a man's whistle drifted from the barn. Luke Carver was fixing the roof again. He'd been there for months now, long enough for the townsfolk to stop whispering and start waving when they saw him at the market beside her. Long enough for his horse to know the way home without a pull on the reins. Long enough for his heart to settle. And though neither of them spoke often about forever, it had settled between them quietly, like the land itself. That afternoon, Clara carried a jug of lemonade to the barn. Luke was crouched on the rafters, his shirt damp with sweat, his hair sticking to his forehead. "You plan on coming down from there before winter?" she called, smiling. He grinned, brushing his arm across his brow. "Depends. You fixin' to invite me to supper?" She raised a brow. "Depends who's asking." He laughed, the sound rich and easy, and it filled the air like sunlight. When he climbed down, she handed him the lemonade. Their fingers brushed, and even after all this time, the touch still sent a quiet thrill through her. They sat together on a bale of hay, sipping in companionable silence. Outside, the world stretched wide and endless. The golden fields, the blue sky, the distant hum of cicadas. Luke glanced at her, his eyes soft. "You ever think about how it all started?" Clara smiled faintly. "I try not to." "Why's that?" "Because if I think too much about the pain that came before, I might not believe I deserve what came after." He nodded slowly, his thumb tracing circles on the glass jug. "You do. You always did." She looked at him then, really looked, and felt that same warmth she'd felt the first time he'd spoken those impossible words. "They said I'd be alone forever," she whispered. Luke's lips curved into that half-smile she'd come to love. Well, they were wrong. That evening, as the sun slipped low and the sky burned crimson, they walked down to the stream that ran behind the cabin. The air smelled of pine and water, and the light shimmered across the ripples like gold coins scattered by heaven itself. Luke stopped at the edge of the water and turned to her. His expression was soft, but there was something steady, unshakable, in his eyes. "Clara," he said quietly, "I ain't much for fancy words. But I've lived enough life to know that second chances don't come easy. When they do, you hold on with both hands." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather cord, tied with a simple silver ring, worn and plain but polished with care. Clara's breath caught. "I found this in a trading post months back," he said. "Couldn't stop thinkin' how it might look in the light on your hand." Her eyes filled, tears shimmering like the stream at their feet. "Luke?" He stepped closer, his voice rough. "I ain't promising riches or an easy road. But I promise I'll never ride away again. I'll build whatever you'll let me build, fix whatever breaks, and love you, till the mountains fall quiet." She stared at him for a moment, trembling, and then whispered, "You already do." He smiled, that rare, open smile she'd only seen a handful of times, and slipped the ring onto her finger. The world seemed to hold its breath. That night, as twilight deepened and the stars scattered across the sky, Luke and Clara sat on the porch side by side. The lantern glowed softly beside them, casting gold over the wood. The silence between them was no longer lonely, it was alive, full of shared breaths and gentle understanding. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "You think forever's real?" she asked quietly. Luke looked out at the horizon where the land met the sky, endless, open and wild. "I used to think it was just a word folks said when they didn't know what else to promise," he said. "But then I met you." He turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Now I reckon forever's not some far-off thing. It's right here. Every morning I wake up beside you. Every time I see that light hit your face. That's forever enough for me." Clara smiled through tears, the kind that didn't hurt anymore. "Then forever starts here," she whispered. And he kissed her, slow, sure, beneath a sky full of stars. The wind sighed through the pines, and somewhere in the distance an owl called. The world turned quietly around them, vast and alive, but for Luke Carver and Clara Jennings, time seemed to stand still. Because sometimes forever doesn't come with grand promises or golden rings. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, a broken heart, and a cowboy who finally came home.